I'm going to present my paper, which is available in full text on the SSRN platform. And the title of the paper might sound familiar to you because it's taken out from Shakespeare Macbeth. And these are the words that Macbeth speaks out when, for the first time, he meets the witches in the woods. So I will actually begin by showing you a small video clip of what happens in this Macbeth scene, because I think this is significant of how lawyers and regulators worldwide feel when they talk about crypto assets and cryptocurrencies. And I will go back to this small video clip at the end of my presentation. There used to be the sound. We heard the sound before, but now...
You just have to play it, I think.
Yeah, no, it's going, but there's no sound. Because we did the test before, actually, yeah. It's full volume.
I think it's related to what they did.
Yeah, what they did here, yeah.
I cannot change
No, okay. Well, basically there's a very dramatic music as a background, and this is Macbeth. He looks at the witches, and he is with his friend Banquo on his right side, and this is the first witch advancing, and it gives him the first prophecy, and then there's the second witch that gives him the second prophecy, and then the third witch with the third prophecy, and from there on the entire tragedy kicks off, and as you know, ends very badly for Macbeth. And I'm sorry you can't hear the sound, but I ensure you there is sound and dialogue here. And you can catch up this video on YouTube anytime, and it's quite dramatic. Well, by the way, this is actually exactly how lawyers and regulators feel today when they look at crypto assets in general. They do not understand what they're talking about. They are frightened, they are confused, they are puzzled. As I anticipated to you, since you are my only guests and we had a long chat, this is also due to the fact that current EU financial and capital markets legislation was drafted in a period when crypto assets did not actually exist, and so nobody took care of regulating, defining, identifying crypto assets at the time because the phenomena was entirely unknown. This thing came up when the new European directives that we now have in force, MiFID II, the Prospectus Directive, the directives on collective asset management, had already been approved and most of the times already implemented within the member states. So what are you? I just want to point out that this is Shakespeare, and you are not William Shakespeare by chance. You're the greatest dramaturgist and poet probably that ever lived, or one of the greatest. And when Shakespeare talks to the witches, he tells them, he asks them, what are you? So there is an objectivation of the witches. He doesn't say, who are you? He says, what are you? He doesn't even understand whether these are living creatures or not. And this, again, is exactly what we feel when we talk about crypto assets and cryptocurrencies. According to the advice that ESMA rendered in January 2019, which is, by the way, the most recent policy paper or position paper that European regulators have taken in the matters of crypto assets, there are more than 2,000 what they identify as being cryptocurrencies. By the way, this definition or notion of cryptocurrencies is not clear because, as you very well know, you might think that a crypto asset is close to a currency or is not, depending on judgments of value which are highly discretional. But by the way, they sort of have identified more than 2,000 crypto assets or cryptocurrencies that are available on European markets at January 2019, and the number is probably growing. And amongst these cryptocurrencies, there's a particular case that needs to be done for ICOs, tokens, which are a particular phenomena that ESMA already tried to define, not truly to regulate, but to define in 2017, and we will see the definition of ICOs tokens given by ESMA at the time. This is a page taken from Coinbase platform, which gives to non-experts, not as you are, the idea of how complex this world can be. This is the page of just the first 11 crypto assets that you can buy, sell, trade on Coinbase, but actually there are more than 200 that are available to trade on Coinbase at the moment, and you can access information on probably 400 different crypto assets at the moment. Coinbase will give you the link to the white paper, if it exists, to a brief description of the entity that has issued the token or the crypto assets whatsoever. Now, this page is significant. I will go back to the pages of Coinbase when I'm near the end of my presentation, because this looks very close to what you find when you open up a trading platform for trading shares, bonds, typically financial instruments. The user experience, but also the kind of services that the platform performs are pretty close, if not identical, to the ones that you would expect from a platform that trades truly financial instruments, with a huge difference, however, that these platforms are not considered at the moment to be platforms that do trade financial assets, and for this reason they are not regulated under European financial markets law. This is the definition that the ESMA gave in November 2017 of, rather than a definition, is a description of what an initial coin offering is, and consequently of what a token issued in the context of an ICO is. ESMA says that an initial coin offering is an innovative way of raising money from the public using so-called coins or tokens, and can also be called an initially token offering or token sale. In an ICO, a business or individual issues coins or tokens and puts them for sale in exchange for fiat currencies such as the euro, or more often virtual currencies, example Bitcoin or Ether. This is the latest attempt provided for by European regulators to define an initial coin offering and a token. And there is no such attempt in relation to, for example, Bitcoin or other tokens or crypto assets that are not issued in the context of an initial coin offering. Now, traditionally, and you will read a lot of stuff in my paper if you're interested in getting references, bibliography, you can simply download the paper from SSRN and you find it there. The paper is being regularly updated. The last update I did was in June. I must say that in this field of research, every day you have something new coming up. But the general approach corresponds, the standard approach. You might find more information, less information, more detailed bibliography according to the author, but basically the approach that today you find in literature and also in ESMA's opinion of January 2019 when it comes to classifying crypto assets under European capital markets or financial markets law is basically the same. And the approach leads us to distinguishing between different worlds, because there are different worlds under which these crypto assets fall. When I talk about worlds, I talk about regulations, and European legislation is built on the basis of European directives. The European directives sort of cut across a certain sector by providing definitions of what they are about, and this creates an approach which leads us to have a lot of siluses. We have a silus for MiFID that regulates financial instruments, as you see in the slide. We have a silus for prospectus regulation that regulates transferable securities. We have European legislation on systems of payments or fiat currencies, but this is not truly something which relates to investments in some kind of assets. It's a regulation which concerns a system of payments such as PSD1, PSD2, and so on. So basically you have this world of European directives, and what you would try to do is to see whether your crypto assets falls within one category or the other. And then you have national legislation. This is very interesting because albeit European legislation is very comprehensive and quite complex, it does not cover everything. Rather, it only covers some matters that are quite specific, and what we are today living in relation to crypto assets proves the fact that European legislation is limited in its scope. It provides definitions of what it wants to regulate. What falls outside those definitions is not regulated. For example, in certain countries we have, such as Italy or Belgium, other categories that may be relevant for the purpose of classifying and regulating crypto assets, such as the category of financial products, which is, by the way, pretty close, with a lot of differences, but pretty close to the Huawei test that the SEC in the US has been using since quite a comprehensive number of years in order to understand whether an asset should fall under its own regulations. But these are the categories. I won't provide details in relation to these categories, but you will find information on these in the paper, because today the approach is necessarily European, and I don't want to stick to any particular legislation at national level. So the top part of the slide is what the European legislation is about. Now, I told you that in all the papers that you would. I say all the papers because everything that I read has this approach. So I'm trying to set out an alternative or to sort of fill a gap in the current literature on the classification of crypto assets, because basically everything that I have read, everything that comes up is based on what I call the traditional bottom-up approach. Some of you, I know, are already familiar with what I'm talking about, because this is exactly, with now variations on the main theme, some things you should distinguish if you compare one paper with the other, but basically all this literature and all the positions that regulators across Europe have taken to the problem of understanding crypto assets comes up from the FINMA opinion and paper of 2015-16, where they sort of proposed what we still use as the basic tool for classifying crypto assets. And this is what I call the bottom-up approach. And what do you do under the bottom-up approach or the traditional approach? You look at the crypto assets, you try and understand what are its characteristics, whether this is an asset that provides to the holder of the token simply access to services or assets, so the utility token. You try rather to understand an alternative, whether that token can be or is effectively used as a means of payment. As you are aware of, there is a lot of discussion as to whether, for example, Bitcoin is effectively an instrument of payment or is a form of investment. Ideas here are quite confused. But you sort of try, you open up your token, you read what the token is about, what kind of services, rights, assets you get when you buy that token, and if you do not really get anything from the token, but you use the token as a means of payment, then you might say that the token is a currency. And if not, if you get some kind of financial reward, or if you get services, or if you get utilities, then you would say if it's utilities or services, it's a utility token, and this falls outside the scope of financial regulation. If you get some kind of financial reward or compensation, such as dividends, interests, you would say that this is a financial token that is maybe similar to shares or similar to bonds. And then if you have national law, again, you might have to consider further elements, such as the ones that you would look at in Italy or in Belgium when you talk about financial products, which would be captured by national law on prospectus, even if they are not financial instruments under European law. So you look at the intrinsic characteristics of the instrument, and this is what I call the bottom-up approach. And you have to make some kind of distinctions. For example, Bitcoin is a typical example of a decentralized structure of an asset which comes out from a decentralized network. There is no issuer, strictly speaking, of Bitcoin. Well, we know that you have miners. You are obviously very proficient with these topics, much more than I am. But if you remember the definition that ESMA gave of initial coin offerings, that definition was based on the idea that you have an issuer of the token, and you cannot really say you have an issuer of a Bitcoin. Bitcoins are being issued as the consequence of a much wider decentralized process where you really cannot identify an issuer. Now, this is very important because this element naturally takes Bitcoin away from the prospectus regulation and the prospectus regime, because the prospectus regime, which is the first regime you have to think about when you issue a token, you have to say, do I have to prepare a prospectus under European legislation? Then eventually you may have exemptions, but you have to think first whether what you're doing falls within the prospectus regulation, and you may be exempted, but you are exempted because there are exemptions. But the prospectus assumes that there is an issuer of the token that you can identify, or at least a small group of people or legal entities that issue the crypto asset, and that would be required to publish the prospectus under European legislation. If you have no such issuer, then this would fall outside that particular prospectus regulation. Initial coin offerings are based on decentralized networks. I have understood that most ICOs use Ethereum as the underlying, have been using Ethereum, at least in the past. I don't know whether it's still the case, but most of them in the past have used Ethereum as the underlying technology, which is decentralized, but clearly in initial kind of coin offerings you have, and this is where the definition of ESMA 2017 comes up, you have an issuer of the crypto asset. You can identify a business organization, a common enterprise, that a company, a corporation, a legal entity of some sort that issues the token under the initial coin offering. And therefore, ICOs are likely to fall under European prospectus regulation if the token that is being issued is not simply a utility token, but has some kind of financial flavor. Other elements that may be considered, I'm quite skeptical about this, but ESMA in its 2019 opinion says that you should distinguish between tokens or crypto assets that are scarce or non-scarce, because if they are non-scarce, such as they say Bitcoin, but Bitcoin in theory is scarce, because at a certain point there will be no more capacity to issue Bitcoin. So today they seem as being they look as non-scarce because there's a tendentially very huge amount of Bitcoins that still may be issued. It's quite different under an initial coin offering because you have a limited number of tokens that are issued in that context. But they say that this may make a difference when you are uncertain as to whether you should consider a token as being financial or non-financial. I don't think this is really important, but this is what they say, so it's important to keep this in mind. But finally, the question is this a good approach to classifying crypto assets? Is this the way that we should look at the problem? And I repeat, virtually all the papers that you will find today use this bottom-up traditional approach, which is the byproduct of the evolution of the FINMA approach that they initially took. So let's go back to the EU categories. I said we have two big topics that we have to discuss when we look at crypto assets, because under European law, the two big siluses we have to look at are prospectus regulation and MiFID. Then there are minor siluses, such as, for example, collective investment schemes, investment funds. Some tokens may look like investment funds, and eventually they may be eventually classified as investment funds. From ESMA's opinion of January 2019, this looks like a residual case because in order to have an investment fund identifiable as such under European regulations, you really need to meet a lot of tests which usually lack in the world of crypto assets, even when the crypto assets has a pool of underlying assets. But this is not sufficient because there are additional rules. So I would rather stick to prospectus and MiFID because they are the real topics that we're talking about. Are crypto assets relevant for European prospectus regulation and MiFID regulation? Now we have to start, and I will be very brief because there are a lot of technicalities, and we lawyers always get mixed up with technicalities, and this is the realm of technicalities. European financial markets legislation is incredible in this respect. So I try to make it simple and stick to the point. And the basic definition that you find in the prospectus regulation is actually linked to the MiFID directive. So the prospectus regulation applies to transferable securities. And transferable securities are defined by going back. There is a cross-reference in the definition of transferable securities in the prospectus regulation to MiFID financial instruments definition. And if you open up this definition, which is quite complex because it has sub definitions, you end up by saying that these transferable securities include shares, bonds, units of collective investment schemes, such as investment funds, and any other instruments which are similar to the above. So you may have something that is clearly labeled under national law in France, in Germany, as a share issued by a Société Anonyme in France, or by an Aktiengesellschaft in Germany, or by a Società per Azioni. This is a share. But under national law, you have hybrid instruments. For example, in Italy, we have the possibility for Società per Azioni to issue virtually any kind of, they're called financial instruments. And these are not shares, so they're not part of the capital of the company, but they are a way through which the company collects money, and these financial instruments may be similar to shares if they provide, for example, voting rights, they bear the typical risk of an equity investment, they give you the right to a certain amount of dividends, or they may be closer to bonds if they do not give you voting rights, they give you a fixed interest or a variable interest, or they may be a strange combination of the two. There are different shades of gray, and there's a huge freedom under national law, both in Italy and in other legal systems, for corporations today to issue instruments which are not specifically called shares or bonds, but they are close to shares or bonds, and these kind of instruments would fall under the prospectus regulation. They would be considered as falling under the prospectus regulation. So if you have a token issued in the context of an initial coin offering, which gives you the voting rights in the general meeting of the issuer, so that you can have your say in relation to a certain corporate matter, it gives you dividends, even if it's not called a share, but it's a token. It's something which is based on a decentralized network, it's based on a blockchain. This would be treated as relevant for a prospectus directive. What is the difference between, I showed you that there is a cross-reference between the prospectus regulation and the MiFID, but there is a huge difference between these two worlds because the underlying matters that are relevant for MiFID are exactly the ones that are relevant for the prospectus regulation. So the basic topics for MiFID are shares, bonds, units of collective investment schemes, and I will talk in a few minutes about derivatives because that's where the tricky part of the MiFID comes up. But there is a difference because an instrument, such as a share, that falls under the prospectus directive would fall under the MiFID directive only if it is negotiable on capital markets, if it is freely negotiable on capital markets. Now, we discussed this a few minutes ago. What does negotiable mean under MiFID? Which actually, what I'm saying is that if you might have something that falls under the prospectus directive, a prospectus regulation today, by the way, because the directive has been repealed and substituted by a regulation that just came into force a couple of weeks ago, but does not fall under MiFID. So you may have a share of a corporation that's relevant for prospectus. If you issue that share, you might have to publish a prospectus, but it's not relevant for MiFID. And what is the difference? The difference lies in the negotiability of the instrument. So you have to understand if the instrument is negotiable. Now, unfortunately, this is a very important notion for the MiFID environment, but there is no definition of what negotiability means. In the whereas of the directive, there is not even one single sentence of what negotiability. It's taken for granted. And in economic and legal literature today, the position stands as follows. We say that an instrument is negotiable when it is freely exchangeable on the market. And please take the word market in the widest possible sense. In this sense, market includes a decentralized network. It would include a decentralized network. If it's transferable in some way, it is negotiable. If it is not transferable, because there are, in the articles of association of the issuer, in the bylaws, in the legal instrument that stands behind your instrument, there are limitations or prohibitions as to the transferability of the instrument, then this would not be negotiable. So it might fall under the prospectus directive, but it wouldn't fall under the MiFID environment. If you ever have difficulties in falling asleep, and if you want to make it fast and you read ESMA's advice, it will only take you a couple of pages. There's a lot of blah, blah, blah on this negotiability, and you understand that even ESMA doesn't really have a clear-cut idea of what negotiability is. This is an opinion that ESMA has published after consulting with 28 supervisory authorities in Europe, and you understand from their opinion that most of these authorities came up with different views on what negotiability is. And the interesting thing of that paper, and that might help you remain awakened at night, is that for the first time ESMA is taking a very practical approach, because they have attached to their very long opinion 6 examples of real existing, truly existing tokens, and they sort of apply their methodology to each of these tokens, and you see that they come up with not always the same idea. For example, case 1, sometimes they say this could be treated as similar to a share, but they say several competent authorities, supervisors in Europe that have provided their feedback, think that it is similar to a collective investment scheme, such as an investment fund, and some say that it is a share, but it is not negotiable because the test of negotiability is not complied with. So it's a very difficult topic where we still do not have a clear indication. But this is basically what you would have, the kind of exercise. You enter into the gym and you do a lot of exercise in relation to classifying crypto assets, and you get all of these assets, you look at how they work, and you try to understand whether they fall in one place or the other. So you end up, some of you are perfectly familiar with the FINMA approach, you still end up with the FINMA conclusion, basically. There are variations, some are trying to refine this approach, but basically we are still there. We have, first of all, payment tokens, which fall outside capital markets regulation. If a token is an instrument of payment, I leave it up to you to decide whether Bitcoin is or is not. I think it is not, but this is my personal opinion. I think it's a form of investment rather than an instrument of payment, but that's my opinion. But it's decentralized, so it makes things very difficult. Now we have the problem of trying to understand what Libra is, which poses issues which are even more complex. But if it's an instrument of payment, this is what Facebook and Libra are saying. We are an instrument of payment. So we have nothing to do with prospectus regulation and with MiFID. Eventually, we agree, we have to apply anti-money laundering, but that's another topic. I'm not concerned with money laundering here. Naturally, money laundering applies to any kind of financial activity today in Europe, but the true problem is to understand whether if you are a payment token, you wouldn't be concerned with prospectuses nor with MiFID. Step 1. Step 2. If you are a utility token, again, you're outside the scope of capital markets regulation because you're not a form of financial investment in any case. You're simply getting utilities, services, or assets. If you're an asset token or a financial token, call it as you like, if you are a financial instrument, you are included in the scope of MiFID and of the prospectus. If you are only a transferable security, you would be outside the scope of MiFID, but inside the scope of prospectus. So it's not so complex in the end if you think about it. The complex exercise is really speak if you can. What are you? I see this thing coming up. I don't even understand whether it's a human being, a living thing, or an object, and I have to look at it, understand its DNA, and then to classify it. But ultimately, the conceptual construction behind the classification of tokens under the traditional approach is pretty easy. And I was, well, probably because I'm not so young anymore, I've been working on these topics since 25, maybe, 25 years, and I've seen it all. I've seen all the evolution of European capital markets legislation right from the beginning when the prospectus regulation and directives didn't even exist. So once this problem came up, and I had the first queries. I'm also a practitioner in Italy. I provide consultancy services to people who want to start up their business. When people came to me at the beginning of all this debate asking me, we were puzzled, we don't understand what we are, for me the exercise was not so difficult because it's a traditional problem of qualification of a contract, of an item under the traditional categories of European legislation. Yes, sometimes understanding what are you may be difficult, I agree, but if you look at the topic, at the object carefully, things might not be so difficult. And then there's a reference, to the USA hallway test that you are probably very familiar about. There are a lot of references in my paper on the hallway test, but this is not really what I'm talking about. Let us suppose now that a token, under this traditional approach, for example, a utility token, falls outside the capital markets regulation because it's a utility token. Now, the questions that are now being discussed is whether these utility tokens, assuming that they are true utility tokens, you have to be very clear. Let us assume that the token is a truly utility token. Should EU legislation be concerned with utility tokens? Yes or no? And there's a huge debate. Some say yes. A few people say no, especially when it comes to AML, anti-money laundering, for example, consumer protection. Should you apply consumer protection rules to utility tokens? And if so, to which degree? Should you require entities that issue utility tokens to comply with certain standards of transparency? Should you be concerned with issues of prudential supervision? Well, the huge fire that has been ignited by the Libra project touches on issues of prudential supervision incredibly, because the central banks are concerned that the enormous impact that Libra might have, would have, certainly on the market, might completely disrupt their capacity of handling monetary policy. So it has huge implications of prudential and stability supervision. Even if the token per se may have nothing to do, I have some doubts as to whether truly Libra has nothing to do with capital markets regulation, but even in that case, you might have some issues that European legislation should consider. And this is a huge debate that's going on. And you will see that in the recent months, some regulators have come up across Europe with proposals to regulate these purely utility tokens as well. We've had an example in Italy. In May this year, Consob actually started and concluded a consultation for a proposal under which they would like to in some way regulate utility tokens. This proposal has stirred a lot of comments, and the basic comment is if you are a financial supervisor and your mission is to supervise financial markets, how can you regulate utility tokens? Utility tokens are outside your scope. They are something different. And so that's a problem, because if you look at the FCA, if you look at the IMF in France, if you look in Germany, in Italy, we do have obviously supervisors on financial markets. So are they competent to regulate these matters? And if yes, how and why? But this is the current debate. So here is where I step in. Here is where I meet my witches, and I sort of turn the world upside down with what I call a top-down approach that takes into account the possible impact that trading platforms and secondary markets might have on the traditional approach. You all know very well that, especially for tokens which are issued in the context of initial coin offerings or similar stuff, the liquidity of a secondary market is very important, because investors look at these assets and they consider whether they would buy it or invest in that asset, also taking into account the existence of a secondary market. But the fact that secondary markets exist, and by the way, the proposal that Consob has set out in May is quite innovative, because they sort of think that a utility token would necessarily be traded on a trading platform. They see the two things as sort of necessarily corrected. So they would not grant a visa, an authorization for an initial coin offering, even of a utility token, if the utility token does not have a trading platform. And trading platforms, I just gave you the example of the initial pages of Coinbase, and this is what you do on these trading platforms. You buy and sell, and the kind of pages that you see are very, very similar, if not identical, to what you find in relation to regulated trading platforms for financial instruments. You have graphics on how the asset has performed. You buy, you sell, you place your order, and you get an instant execution as an end user. Because one of the functions of the platform is also to provide this kind of liquidity, even if then the manager of the platform has to set off and regulate the transaction on the blockchain in a longer period of time. But you would see on your screen that the transaction has been immediately settled. So this raises an important topic, because utility tokens, just like financial tokens, may be financial instruments that fall within the scope of MiFID if they are traded on a MiFID trading venue and if they qualify as derivatives. And this is the missing point of the traditional bottom-up approach, because the bottom-up approach does not really consider what happens on secondary markets as important. They say that a utility token is a utility token because genetically it's a utility token. But if the utility token is traded on a MiFID trading venue and has a derivative component because it has a value that varies according to an underlying index asset of any kind, it would be considered most likely as a derivative for MiFID purposes, and therefore will become a financial instrument, and it will lose its qualification as a non-financial asset, which is the starting point of the bottom-up approach. Now, you cannot read this, and I'm just happy that you can't, because this is the MiFID list of financial instruments, which is quite complex, but let me give you an example. Just look very briefly at number 6. This is how MiFID defines commodity derivatives. MiFID says a commodity derivative is a financial instrument, so it is captured by MiFID if it can be physically settled, not just settled in cash, provided that they are traded on a regulated market, an MTF, or an organized trading facility. So a utility token, which is not financial in nature, because it does not give you any kind of financial reward or any kind of financial right, if it is traded on an organized trading platform under MiFID, such as a regulated market, an MTF or an OTF, may be considered as a derivative on commodities, and thus as a financial instrument regulated by MiFID. Ultimately, so this is the missing link. I think it's very important that this link is sort of attached to all the considerations that are being set on the table when it comes to classifying crypto assets, but nobody has already done so. But the story is not over, because there is one last point which is very, very important in my opinion, and I discussed this in my paper as well, which is, when does a MiFID trading venue actually exist? You see, the definition of a commodity derivative is that it's a derivative that is traded on a regulated market, an MTF or an OTF. Now, I don't want to bother you excessively with the definitions of regulated market, MTF or OTF, but I just want to point out one thing, that in the MiFID language, a trading venue, i.e. a regulated market, an MTF or an OTF, is based on the assumption that it is a centralized venue. Look at the definition, for example, of multilateral trading facility. It is a multilateral system operated by an investment firm or a market operator. But so when MiFID 1 and 2 were written, MiFID 1 in 2004, not the Middle Ages, prehistory, and MiFID 2 was written in 2011 and 12 and then approved and voted in 2014. The idea was obviously that the trading platforms were centralized, and you have a market operator which stands at the center of the system, such as the one that you have on Coinbase. Coinbase is centralized. You have Coinbase that sort of takes care of having the negotiations and the trades being executed. But if you lose centralization, and if you think of having an entirely decentralized secondary market for the exchange of the tokens, then you would fall outside the scope of MiFID again, even if you have a commodity derivative as the one that I defined. So it's an interesting phenomenon, because you are captured by MiFID if you're a commodity, if your token falls under the definition of a commodity derivative, but in order to do so, the commodity derivative, the utility token, therefore, needs to be traded on a centralized, organized platform. If it is not, then you fall outside the scope of MiFID again. And it's very interesting to read, and now I finish because time is over and we can have a couple of questions if you wish. What does centralization mean in the context of MiFID? And by making it short, in MiFID you have a centralized trading platform. So you have a platform which is operated by an investment firm or a market operator, not by looking at the entity that provides the technological infrastructure. That's not the point. The technological infrastructure is something that can be outsourced. So the market operator of a centralized trading venue under MiFID is the operator that sets the trading rules of the platform, not the one that builds the infrastructure. And this is an interesting point of MiFID that might have an impact on what I was saying. So decentralization and blockchain technology may undermine the approaches that we have seen. And if we can imagine, but I think this is first of all a technological issue, but if we can imagine a secondary market for the exchange of tokens which is entirely decentralized, then what the conclusion would be that utility tokens would again fall outside the scope of European financial legislation as we know it today, whereby asset token or financial tokens, call them as you like, would be in the scope of MiFID or prospectus, because that's already clear under the bottom-up approach. So the problem is, how do we classify utility tokens? And taking into consideration or not taking into consideration secondary markets and trading platforms has a huge impact on how you classify these utility tokens. So if you look at the pages of Coinbase or any centralized platform such as this one, the true question here is whether these are utility tokens, because they have utility function, but do they have a derivative component? Do they have a value that depends upon an underlying? In most of these cases, the answer is yes. And so the issue is, what should we do with this thing? Are we really sure that the bottom-up approach is satisfactory, that this should not be considered already as financial instrument, and that the market operator of the platform should not be in a position as to be subject to MiFID and licensed under MiFID because he is actually organizing a centralized trading venue for something that would be considered as a commodity derivative under MiFID? Okay, so basically this is what my paper is about, and I think we have just a few minutes for questions. For those of you who were not here, I actually usually close my presentation by showing the witches scene again, if I find it. If I don't find it, because it's been sort of bypassed, as you think of the questions, I will look for the clip again, just for the benefit of those who weren't here. I'm sorry there's no sound, but there's a very terrific music underneath, and this is when Macbeth, for those of you who weren't here, meets the witches and says, "What are you?" And this is the kind of problem that we face when we try to classify crypto assets. The witches come up. Okay. First prophecy, second and third prophecy. And he's quite puzzled. He doesn't really understand who these guys are. I think that our regulators should look at this scene very carefully and try to understand what's going on. Okay, so thank you, and yes, you have a question?
Maybe this was covered, and I'm sorry if
Yeah,
it was,
no
because
problem.
I joined a bit later.
No problem.
It's just at the end of the day, is the authority who decide what's ICO, what's not. So we may argue and disagree. So I don't know. Do you think we can convince anyone or any regulator, or do you think there is a point actually trying to put forward a different view or opinion? Because I'm like, this is a regulator. They have the authority. So
Yeah.
whatever we say.
Yeah, it's obviously a very good question, and the problem is that regulators today are puzzled. They are exactly like Macbeth. And if you read the ESMA's opinion of this year, it's January 2019, you clearly understand that they follow the traditional approach. The one, I don't know whether you were already in the room when I described this approach, which is the typical approach, the one followed originally by FINMA in Switzerland. They look at the crypto asset, they try to understand how it works, what kind of rights, what kind of underlying duties or obligations arise from this thing, and they would say this is similar to a share, this is similar to a bond, and that's what they're trying to do. There are a lot of uncertainties, and you see this very clearly in the ESMA's approach, and they're trying to find, at least in Europe, a common position, but they haven't found one yet because there are different views. But at the same time, in this sort of comprehensive last opinion that we have, the dimension of secondary markets is completely forgotten. And my feeling is that if they do not take that into account, the exercise they are doing might be entirely useless, because they would struggle to identify utility tokens on the one side, which are outside the scope of financial regulation in Europe, and other kind of tokens that are instead in the scope. But then utility tokens might come back through the window when they are traded on secondary markets, because they might be considered as commodity derivatives under MiFID. And this is something which at the moment is completely forgotten.
Maybe a risk, maybe an opportunity, equally, like if we act before anything being set
Absolutely.
in stone. Yes.
Absolutely.
Sorry to cut you
Yeah.
off. We're late for the other session. We have
Yeah.
to end it there.
Okay.
Apologies.
Okay, thank you.